Hey y'all, this is Liz, and this is my channel, Cornbread Fabulous. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my granddaddy. My granddaddy's nickname was Toot, and do not ask me why. I have no idea. I just knew that everybody called him Toot. Toot Mosley. So, I'm in first grade, and Miss Amos asked each of us, when it came our turn, to stand up and tell what our parents' names were and where we lived, because we were learning, our addresses and things. Well, I lived right across from the school, so I just said, I live across from the school, and my granddaddy's name is Toot. And Miss Amos said, no, that's not. She said, what is your address? And I was like, I'm across the road. And then she said, and also, what is your granddaddy's real name? Toot is a nickname. And I couldn't believe it. I had a nickname, but I didn't even know it was a nickname. I just knew that everybody called me Dink. So when I get home from school, Miss Amos had said, you come back tomorrow and we're going to go back to you and you tell me your address and you tell me your grandfather's name. So I told my granddaddy, I said, this is what happened today at school. And Miss Amos said that your name is not Toot, that's a nickname. And I said, what is your name, Granddaddy? And he said, my name is George Washington. So I think my granddaddy just assumed that I knew his last name was Mosley, but I don't think I did. Because I had a different last name from my granddaddy. And so when he said his name was George Washington, I assumed that was his name. That was the entirety of it. And he taught me my address, and I learned it. And so the next day, when it came my turn, I stood up, and I was very proud, and I said my address. And then Miss Amos said, now what is your granddaddy's name? And I said, very confidently, my granddaddy's name is George Washington. And she made me stand in the corner. So when I got picked up that day by my granddaddy, I told him what happened. And I said, she doesn't believe me that your name's George Washington. So my granddaddy went into the school and found Miss Amos, pulled out his driver's license and showed it to her. And she laughed and laughed because I didn't know his last name was Mosley. So anyway, lesson learned. But the origin of that name is hilarious. So I was having lunch with my granddaddy at the Murphy house when I was probably 19 years old. And a man walks in and he says, Furman May Mosley, how are you doing, man? And so my granddaddy shook hands with him, and he knew him, and they talked for a few minutes, and then the man walked off. And I said, Granddaddy, why did he call you Furman May? And he said, well, that was my real name. And I said, well, what is George Washington if that's not your real name? And he said, well, when I was born, my older brother was supposed to walk into town, which was, the nearby town. It was about 5 miles from where they lived. And he was supposed to register the birth of my granddaddy in 1928 at the courthouse, I guess. But by the time he got there, he had forgotten the name that his mama said to give him. So when the clerk asked, what's your baby brother's name? He looked around. The first thing he saw was a portrait of George Washington. So he told her his name is George Washington Mosley. So the lady didn't bat an eye. She filled out his work, and when my great uncle came back home, he never told a soul that was the name he had put on the birth certificate. Well, flash forward to the year that my granddaddy had to sign up for the draft. And he had to go, I guess, for a physical. And there were all these guys standing out there in the line. Everybody kept getting their name called. And then they started calling out, George Washington Mosley. George Washington Mosley. So my granddaddy stepped forward and he said, well, I'm Mosley, but I'm not George Washington Mosley. I'm Furman May Mosley. So they looked on their paperwork and they said, well, when's your birthday? And so he told me, he said, well, that's the birthday that we have right here. And this is the name that's on your birth certificate. And so from that day on, my granddaddy was George Washington Mosley. And I don't even think my great uncle got in trouble for that mess. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. Till next time, stay cornbread fabulous.